The most dangerous thing a man can do is fall in love with a woman who was never meant to stay. The night Sofia Caruso nearly died began with a broken heel. She had been walking back from the Palazzo dei Normanni, notebooks clutched against her chest, the warm September air carrying the scent of jasmine and diesel and the distant salt promise of the Mediterranean. Palermo at dusk was a city that could make you forget yourself. All that crumbling Baroque grandeur, the orange vendors calling out in Sicilian dialect, the shadows pooling gold and violet between the narrow streets. Sofia had been in the city for 3 weeks now, and she still hadn't gotten used to it, still caught herself stopping mid-stride to tilt her face toward some ancient stone archway, some bougainvillea bleeding crimson over a balcony rail, and think, This is why I said yes. The humanitarian training program through her hospital in Boston had seemed straightforward enough on paper. 6 weeks embedded with a local medical cooperative in Palermo, learning field triage and mass casualty protocols, then home. Her colleagues had called it a vacation dressed up as work. Her mother had called it madness. Sofia had called it necessary. Because at 31, she was starting to feel the particular ache of a life that had been carefully, sensibly constructed. And careful and sensible were beginning to feel like synonyms for small. So she had said yes to Palermo. She had said yes to the peeling apartment on Via Maqueda with its unreliable hot water and its spectacular view of the rooftops. She had said yes to the long afternoons at the cooperative clinic, to the espresso that arrived at breakfast already threatening to dismantle her nervous system, to the stray cats that colonized the building's courtyard and regarded her with the particular disdain of creatures who owed nothing to anyone. She had not said yes to the broken heel which snapped away from her left shoe with a crack like a gunshot just as she turned down Via dell'Incoronazione. She stumbled, caught herself against the wall of a narrow alley, looked down at the orphaned heel still lying on the cobblestones 3 steps back, and said something in English that would have surprised the nuns at the Catholic school she'd attended for 8 years. She was still fishing the heel out from between the cobblestones because she was constitutionally unable to simply abandon things, when she heard the sound from the courtyard beyond the arched gate to her left. A wet, ragged sound. Not a voice exactly, more like a man trying to breathe through something that had gotten in the way of breathing. Sofia went still. She was a nurse. She had been a nurse for 9 years, in emergency departments and field hospitals and community clinics, and one thing that 9 years of nursing teaches you is to categorize sounds the way other people categorize weather. Instinctively, constantly, with a professional part of your mind that never entirely went off duty. The sound she was hearing now registered in that part of her mind as respiratory distress, possible obstruction, possible chemical, possible cardiac event, needs assessment immediately. The rest of her mind said, This is Sicily. This is a dark alley. This is not your business. She pushed open the gate. The courtyard on the other side was small and old, walled in crumbling ochre plaster, a dead fountain at its centre overrun with weeds. A single security light buzzed yellow above a locked door, and on the ground near the fountain, propped against its stone base with his long legs stretched before him and his expensive suit jacket pulled beneath him, was the most beautiful man Sofia Caruso had ever seen in her life, which was an inconvenient thing to notice when he appeared to be dying. He was tall, she could tell even prone, with a kind of frame that suggested a body built for force rather than grace, though the dark suit he wore was so perfectly cut it imposed a certain elegance regardless. His face was all hard angles and deep shadows in the security light, a jaw that could have been chiselled from Sicilian limestone, a mouth that was full and set in something that had probably been a hard line before whatever was happening to him had dissolved his control. Dark hair, longer than fashionable. Eyes, when they found her across the courtyard, because he heard the gate, she was certain of it, even in this state he heard it. Eyes so dark they were nearly black, and burning with something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, and was entirely, absolutely directed at her. Around him she registered 2 men, both unconscious on the flagstones, both in suits that matched his, both breathing. She could see the rise and fall of their chests from here, but profoundly, medically unconscious. "Don't," the man started, in Italian, and it came out wrong, came out thickened and wrong, and she could see his hand move toward the inside of his jacket by reflex before whatever was in his system stopped him. "I'm a nurse," Sofia said, in English first, then in Italian. "Sono infermiera," because her Italian was functional, if not fluid, constructed from 6 months of evening classes and 3 weeks of Sicilian immersion, and it seemed important to establish this fact before he used whatever was in that jacket on her. "I can help you. Can you tell me what happened?" He looked at her for a long moment. In that moment, she crossed the courtyard to him because standing at the gate while someone potentially died was not something she was physiologically capable of doing. And she crouched in front of him and got her first clear look at him and understood that whatever this was, it was serious. His lips had a slight bluish cast, his breathing was laboured, she could hear it up close, the effort behind each inhale, the way his diaphragm was fighting for it. His pupils, when she checked, were unequal and sluggish. His skin was clammy, cool to the touch despite the warm night. His pulse, which she found at his wrist without asking permission, because permission was a luxury for less urgent situations, was slow and irregular. Not a heart attack, not a stroke. The pattern of symptoms, the unequal pupils, the respiratory depression, the profound sedation of his 2 companions versus his relative alertness, the speed of onset, was arranging itself in her mind with the cold, efficient logic of differential diagnosis. "You were poisoned," she said. His eyes, which had not left her face, flickered. Confirmation, she thought. Or perhaps surprise that she had arrived at it so quickly. "What did you eat tonight? Drink?" She was already opening her bag, already going through the small emergency kit she carried out of habit, the habit of 9 years. "Were you with these men when it started? Did someone give you something, food, drink, at dinner?" "The wine," he said. Just that. 2 words in Italian, and even rough and slow as they were, they landed with a weight that told her this man was accustomed to his words meaning something. "How long ago?" He considered. Even poisoned, even with his system fighting through whatever had been slipped into a glass of Sicilian wine, he considered carefully before speaking. "Perhaps 30 minutes. 30 minutes. She did the arithmetic. Enough time for significant absorption. The good news, if you could call it that, was that he was still coherent. The bad news was that coherence was not a stable state with what she suspected was in his system. She had seen atropine poisoning once in her second year of nursing, a confused elderly woman who'd eaten nightshade berries from her own garden. She had seen opiate overdose more times than she liked to count. What she was looking at had elements of both, but was neither. And there was a word for that. A word for substances that acted on the autonomic nervous system in ways that were specifically designed to be difficult to identify and treat. And the word was professional. Someone had paid a professional to poison this man, and not quite paid them enough, because whatever the dose had been, it had taken his two companions to the floor and left him fighting. "I need to know what it was," she said. "If you have any way to find out, if someone could—" "What do you need?" he said. And it was the way he said it. Not, "What do you mean?" or "What are you talking about?" but simply, "What do you need?" As if the resources of the world were available to him, and all she had to do was name them. "Activated charcoal," she said. "Atropine, if we're dealing with an organophosphate, but I don't think we are. Flumazanil, if there's a benzodiazepine component. A hospital would be ideal." She looked at him steadily. "I'm guessing a hospital is not on the table." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite not. "Tell me what to call," he said, "and I will call it." She told him. He made 2 phone calls in the time it took her to get him positioned more safely, to monitor his airway, to keep talking to him, because keeping him conscious was the priority right now. Consciousness was the thing between him and his lungs simply giving up on the work. He spoke to someone in Sicilian dialect, too rapid for her to follow, and whatever he said brought results in 11 minutes. A man appearing at the courtyard gate with a medical bag that cost more than Sofia's monthly rent, and contained, among other things, exactly what she had asked for. She worked in the yellow security light, with her broken heel still in her bag and the scent of Palermo's night all around her, jasmine and stone and the distant sea. And she did not think about why this man had been poisoned, or by whom, did not think about the guns she could now see holstered on the unconscious men, did not think about what it meant that a single phone call could produce a private medical supply in under 12 minutes. She thought only about his breathing, about his pulse, about the specific clinical calculus of keeping a human being alive. When it was done, when his breathing had eased and his colour had returned and his pulse had steadied under her fingers, he looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in English this time, perfect English, with the faintest Italian accent, "Your name." Not "what is your name?" Not a question at all. "Sofia," she said. "Sofia Caruso." "Dante Ricci," he said. She didn't know the name then. She would learn it later, would learn what it meant, what weight it carried in Sicily and beyond Sicily, how many men had heard it in the last moments of their lives. But in that yellow-lit courtyard, with his pulse steady under her fingers and the broken heel of her shoe in her bag, she learned only the name, and it settled in her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. "You saved my life," he said. "I kept you alive long enough to save your own," she said. "You should see a proper doctor." "I have proper doctors." "Then call one of them." "I already have." He looked at her with those dark, burning eyes. "And I will need to ask something of you, Sofia Caruso, that you will not want to give me." She should have run, she thought later. She should have stood up with her broken shoe and her notebooks and her carefully sensible life, and she should have run. Instead, She stayed very still and waited to hear what it was. They brought her in a car with tinted windows that smelled of leather and money. She hadn't agreed precisely, but she also hadn't been given the architecture for disagreement, not in the way that involved raised voices or explicit coercion, not in the way she could have pointed to later and called force. What Dante Ricci had done in that courtyard, in that quiet voice, still roughened by poison and effort, was simply explain the geometry of the situation. She had seen his face in a context that was not meant for witnesses. She knew his name now, and names were dangerous things when attached to dangerous knowledge. He was, he said, not a man with the luxury of trusting strangers, and so she would need to come with him for a time while he determined what was to be done. While he determined what was to be done, as if she were a problem to be solved, as if she were an item on a list. Sofia had looked at him for a long moment. His colour had returned by then, the bluish cast gone from his lips, his breathing regular and unlaboured. He was sitting up straight against the fountain base, and the transformation from the man who'd been fighting through organ failure 20 minutes ago to the man who was now explaining her situation to her with the calm of someone discussing property was striking and not entirely comfortable to witness. "You're telling me you're going to hold me against my will," she said. "I'm telling you," he said carefully, "that I'm going to ask you to be my guest until I can be certain of your discretion." "That's the same thing." He didn't deny it. She had weighed her options, which was to say she had weighed the two unconscious armed men on the flagstones and the man with the burning eyes who had just demonstrated that a phone call could produce a private pharmacy in 11 minutes. And she had calculated. "How long?" she said. "I don't yet know. I have obligations, a training program, people who will notice I'm missing." "You'll be allowed to communicate," he said, "within reason." She had wanted to ask what within reason meant, but she'd suspected she wouldn't like the answer. And they were loading his companions into a second car by then, and a woman appeared at her elbow, small, 50s, with the face of someone who had witnessed many things and chosen to carry them quietly, and asked, in Italian, if Sofia would like to accompany her. So she had. The mansion was 40 minutes outside Palermo, in the hills above the coastal plain, surrounded by citrus groves and high stone walls, and a gate that opened to a keypad and biometrics, and the quiet recognition of men who stood at intervals in the shadows of the grounds. Sofia noted them without comment. She noted the cameras, the security lighting, the careful placement of men and technology at every approach. She noted all of it the way she noted symptoms, cataloguing, assessing, filing. The house itself took her breath away, which she resented. It was old, 18th century, she thought, maybe older in its bones. Built from the pale golden stone of the Sicilian hills, 3 stories tall and symmetrical in the way that spoke of someone who had cared deeply about order. The interior was all marble floors and high ceilings and tall windows that faced west, so that as the moon rose over the sea, the rooms filled with a silver light that made everything look like the interior of a dream. There were paintings on the walls, real ones, old ones, a woman in a yellow dress, a landscape of some northern place she didn't recognize, a portrait of a man with Dante's jaw and different eyes. There were orange trees in the courtyard at the centre of the house, their fruit still green, their blossoms filling the night air with a sweetness that was almost too much to bear. The woman, whose name was Concetta, which Sofia learned later, brought her to a room on the 2nd floor. It was large and simply furnished, A bed with white linen, a writing desk, a bathroom with a tub that could have held 3 people comfortably. There was a window that looked out over the grove, and Sofia stood at it for a long time after Concetta left, looking at the dark shapes of the orange trees in the moonlight, listening to the nightjars. She was a prisoner in a beautiful place. She understood this. She also understood that hysteria would not help her, and that the man downstairs, who was presumably now in the care of whatever proper doctors had been summoned, was the kind of man to whom hysteria would communicate vulnerability, and vulnerability, she suspected, was not a language that would serve her here. She would be calm. She would be professional. She would find out what the situation was and navigate it. She fell asleep eventually, fully dressed, on top of the white linen, and the last thing she thought was that she had not told anyone where she was. And the thought should have been more frightening than it was, and she was too exhausted to understand why it wasn't. Morning arrived in bands of light through the tall shutters, and with it Concetta, bearing a tray with espresso and cornetti, and a small pitcher of fresh squeezed orange juice, and the information that Signor Ricci would see her at 9. "See me," Sofia said, "or question me." Concetta's expression was entirely neutral. "He uses the word vedere," she said, "to see," and left. At 9, Sofia was shown to a room on the ground floor that was clearly an office, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a desk large enough to land a helicopter on, maps on one wall marked in a language of symbols she didn't speak. Dante Ricci was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, and he had changed from the ruined suit of the previous night into something equally expensive and dark, and his hands were clasped behind him with the particular stillness of a man who had decided where to put his energy. He turned when she came in. In the daylight, without the yellow security light and the emergency and the fear, she could see him properly for the first time. He was 40, she estimated, or thereabouts, the kind of 40 that had been arrived at through effort and attention, with no softness anywhere in his face or his body, but a texture to the skin around his eyes that spoke of lost sleep and, she thought, of grief, though she couldn't have said what told her that. He was taller than she had realized, and his eyes, which she had thought in the darkness were simply dark, were in fact a very deep brown, the colour of old wood or dark earth, and they were currently conducting what felt like a structural assessment of her. "How do you feel this morning?" she asked, because she was a nurse, and it was the first question she thought of. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise. "Better, because of you." "Good." She sat down without being invited to. "Then perhaps you can tell me how long you intend to keep me here, and we can discuss what comes next." He crossed to the desk, did not sit, remained standing, which she recognized as a dominance posture, and which she decided to ignore. "There are people," he said carefully, "who want me dead. Last night was their most recent attempt. The fact that they came so close means that someone within my circle has been compromised." A pause. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "You don't know who you can trust?" "No." "And I saw your face. I know your name. I treated you, which means I know details about your condition that could, theoretically, be used to identify what was used against you. And by whom." She looked at him steadily. "So you're holding me here until you figure out who tried to kill you?" Because you can't risk me going back to Palermo and telling someone. Yes, he said. Do you think I would? I think, he said, that I've survived 20 years by not relying on what I think people would or wouldn't do. He held her gaze. I don't know you. No, you don't. She folded her hands in her lap. So how do we fix that? Another shift in his face. This time she caught the edge of it, something that might, in another man, have been the beginning of a smile. That, he said, is what I'd like to discuss, he told her, in the careful, measured language of a man who had long practice in revealing exactly as much as was strategically necessary, the shape of his situation. Not the details, not yet, but the shape. That he was the head of a family that had held power in Sicily for 3 generations. That power at this level and of this nature was never entirely safe. That the attempt on his life last night had been more sophisticated than any previous attempt, which told him something about the resources of the person behind it. That until he had identified and neutralized that person, his circle was a compromised thing, and anyone who had seen him in a compromised state was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with this, he said. I'm asking you to understand it. I understand it, Sofia said. I don't accept it, but I understand it. This surprised him. She watched it happen, the very slight recalibration, the small adjustment of whatever she was in his estimation. What do you mean, you don't accept it? I mean that I'm going to keep asking you to release me, every day, calmly and clearly, because I don't think screaming at you will accomplish anything. But I want it on record that I think this is wrong, and that I intend to make you see that eventually. She met his eyes. How long? Your best estimate. He looked at her for a moment. 2 weeks, perhaps less. She calculated. 6 days remained of her training program, then a flight home from Palermo's Falcone Borsellino airport on the 14th. 14 days was 2 days over. 2 days, for her entire life to tip sideways. Fine, she said. 2 weeks, but in 2 weeks you let me go. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer, and Sofia filed that away in the part of her mind that was always taking notes. You'll have the run of the house, he said, and the grounds. You'll have a phone, limited, monitored, but functional. If you need anything, ask Concetta. He paused. And I would ask that you stay away from the western wing. Why? Because I'm asking you to. She thought about pressing, decided it wasn't the hill to die on today. All right, she said. Is that everything? For now. She stood, crossed to the door. At the threshold she turned, because she was also constitutionally incapable of leaving something unsaid. For what it's worth, the person who poisoned you knew what they were doing. The compound they used was designed to incapacitate without immediate lethality, which suggests they wanted you alive initially, which suggests interrogation was the intended follow-up. You should think about what information you have that someone wants badly enough to plan something like this. She left before he could respond. Behind her, in the office with the maps and the books and the morning light coming in at a long angle through the tall windows, Dante Ricci stood very still and looked at the empty doorway for a long time. The mansion had its own rhythms, and Sofia learned them the way she learned everything, systematically, patiently, through observation. Breakfast was served at 7:30 in a dining room that could have accommodated 20, but was set each morning for the solitary occupation of whoever was present. Dante did not appear at breakfast. She gathered from Concetta that he worked through the early morning and ate, if he ate, at his desk. Lunch was at 1, and he appeared for this sometimes, sat at the far end of the long table and ate quickly and silently, and watched her with those dark eyes that held more questions than he asked. Dinner was at 8, a formal and somewhat absurd meal for 2 people in a room designed for a dynasty, with candles and Sicilian wine and food that arrived in courses and was uniformly extraordinary. He was not cruel, she would grant him that. She would also grant him that he was exceptionally difficult to read. She had learned in 9 years of nursing to read people, to cut through what they said and hear what they meant, to understand distress and denial and the complex negotiations people made with their own pain. Dante Ricci defeated most of her instruments. He was not cold, exactly. There was something in him that burned too steadily to be called cold. But he was contained in a way that suggested long practice. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words that constituted an answer. He did not volunteer anything. He watched her constantly, in the manner of someone cataloguing a thing they had not yet classified, and it was deeply, unsettlingly intimate, that quality of his attention, like being the only object in a room of perfect focus. On the second day, she found the library. It was on the first floor, in the eastern wing, a room that ran the full depth of the house and smelled of old paper and beeswax and the citrus that drifted in through the windows that faced the grove. The shelves were crammed, not decoratively arranged, but genuinely crammed, the books leaning and stacked and dog-eared, the accumulated reading of someone who had actually read. She ran her fingers along the spines: Italian law, Sicilian history, classical literature in 3 languages, philosophy, economics, and then, unexpectedly, heart-catchingly, an entire shelf of translated English novels. Jane Austen, Hemingway, Toni Morrison, Graham Greene, and, peculiarly, a fat, battered copy of Pride and Prejudice that had been read so many times the spine had separated. She pulled out the green, the quiet American, because it seemed appropriate, and settled into the deep chair by the window and read until the light changed. Dante found her there in the late afternoon. She felt him before she heard him, some animal awareness she couldn't explain, and looked up to find him standing in the doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and an expression on his face that she couldn't name, but that made her chest constrict slightly. "I wasn't sure if this room was out of bounds," she said. "No." He came in slowly, like he was deciding something with each step, went to the shelves, stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought, something happened here, some memory, some presence in this room that preceded her. "Who read all of these?" she asked. "My father, mostly." A pause. "And I." "The Pride and Prejudice is destroyed," she said. He turned, looked at the shelf she was indicating. Something moved through his face. "That was my mother's." She wanted to ask more. The look on his face stopped her. Not a warning look, not a "don't go there" look, but something more raw than that, something that said the wound was real and still open, and Sofia had enough clinical experience to know when to let a wound breathe. She looked back at her book. He stayed in the library. He didn't speak again, just pulled a book from the shelf, Italian, hardback, She didn't catch the title, and sat in the other deep chair, the one by the cold fireplace, and read. And for an hour they sat in the old library, with the citrus groves outside and the Sicilian afternoon going golden and bronze around them. And they read in the same room, and it was the most domestic and unlikely thing Sofia had experienced since she arrived in Sicily, and possibly in several years before that. She asked Concetta about him on the third day, casually, over the shared task of sorting herbs in the kitchen garden, rosemary and sage, and something purple she couldn't identify that Concetta called Melissa. He grew up here, Sofia asked, because she wanted to ask about his family, but didn't want to alarm the woman with directness. He was born in this house, Concetta said, with the pride of someone who had witnessed the birth. His grandfather built it. His father extended the eastern wing. She clipped the rosemary with the efficient movements of long practice. When Signor Ricci returned to take the house, after his father died, he changed very little. When did his father die? A brief pause. 7 years ago. The clipping continued. There was also his sister. Sofia looked up. She died, Concetta said, simply, without inflection, in the way people speak of things they have had a long time to absorb. 4 years ago. She was 25. Sofia thought of the portrait in the hallway, the young woman in the painting she'd assumed was a historical ancestress, whose eyes had Dante's quality of burning attention. How? Concetta's hands stilled for just a moment. She was used, she said, as a message. Then she resumed her clipping, and Sofia understood that this was the end of that particular line of inquiry. She thought about it all afternoon, thought about what it meant to be the last of something, the last Ricci in this house that had been built for a dynasty, the last guardian, as she was beginning to think of him, of whatever the family had represented. She thought about what grief did to a person over time, whether it calcified or dissolved, whether it became armour or excavation. She was thinking about this at dinner that evening, when Dante, who had been silently occupying the other end of the table in his usual manner, said, without preamble, "You were in Afghanistan." Sofia looked up. "I'm sorry?" "The way you moved in the courtyard, the way you worked, without hesitation, without panic. It's a particular kind of calm." He was looking at her steadily. "You've worked in conflict zones." She set down her fork. "Iraq for 2 months, a field hospital in the north, and 9 months at a trauma centre in Baltimore, which, I would argue, counts." "How long have you been a nurse?" 9 years. She paused. "You've been asking about me." "Of course." Not even slightly apologetic about it. Of course he had. Of course his phone calls the previous night and the morning after had included whatever her name produced in his particular system of information. She considered being offended, and then decided that in his position she would have done exactly the same. "What did you find?" she said. Sofia Elena Caruso, 31, born in Providence, Rhode Island, to Rosaria and Marco Caruso. Italian-American, 3rd generation. Nursing degree from Brown, additional certification in emergency medicine from Johns Hopkins. No criminal record. No significant debts. No political affiliations. He picked up his wineglass. "Your last relationship ended 14 months ago." She stared at him. You found out that I told you. I don't trust what I haven't verified." He said it without apology, but something in his expression acknowledged that this was perhaps a line. "I'm sorry. That last part was unnecessary." The apology surprised her more than the surveillance. She had not expected him to be capable of it. "Well," she said, "since we're sharing, Dante Ricci, 41, born in this house, took over leadership of the Cosa Nostra's Palermo family at 34 after his father's death. Unmarried, notoriously private." She held his gaze. "Survived an assassination attempt 3 days ago in which an American nurse unfortunately got involved." He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do yet, something that changed the whole topography of his face. He laughed, a short sound, real and unguarded, and it lasted only a moment, but it was there, and Sofia felt it in her sternum like a struck chord. "You Googled me," he said. "Concetta has a phone." "Of course she does." He shook his head, and the laughter faded, but the warmth of it lingered in his face, in the slight easing around his eyes. "How much did you find?" "Enough to know what you are, not enough to know who." The warmth didn't disappear exactly, but it changed, deepened, became more complicated. "And what is the difference?" "What you are is a fact," Sofia said. "Who you are is a question." She picked up her fork again. "I'm still working on it." She looked down at her plate and felt his gaze on her like a physical thing, like the warmth of the candles, like the weight of the Sicilian night pressing gently at the tall windows, and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble that had nothing to do with being held against her will. On the 5th day she found the roses. She had been exploring the grounds in the mornings, methodically, because the systematic cataloguing of her environment felt like a form of control, and control was something she was running low on. The citrus grove occupied most of the western side, rows of orange and lemon trees stretching toward the high stone wall in the organized geometry of something that had been planted with intention. The eastern grounds were more formal, topiary and flagstone and a long reflecting pool that had gone slightly feral at its edges, lily pads spreading across the surface, frogs doing their morning work in the shallows. The roses were behind a door in the southern wall that she'd assumed was locked. It was not locked. It opened onto a walled garden that had been invisible from outside, a space roughly 30 feet by 40, protected on all sides by high old stone, and on the south by the hillside itself. And within it, in a state that was somewhere between wild and tended once, long ago, and then loved from a distance, while the love itself remained, were roses. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps. Every colour she could name and colours she couldn't, climbing the walls and sprawling across the flagstones and arching over the rusted iron frame of a pergola in the garden's centre. Deep red and pale cream and coral and the pink of a shell held up to light, and the white of something that had never decided to be anything but itself. The scent was extraordinary. Rich and layered, and nothing like the roses she knew from florists or gardens at home. More complex than those, darker, carrying something earthy beneath the sweetness. She was standing in the centre of it, her face turned up to the morning light, when she heard the door behind her. She turned. Dante stood in the doorway, and the expression on his face when he saw where she was, in the rose garden amid the wilderness of colour and scent, was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Not distress exactly, something older and more interior than distress, something that lived in the same neighbourhood as grief. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "The door wasn't locked and It's fine," he said, but he didn't move from the doorway. She looked at the roses, then back at him. Were these planted for someone? A pause that answered the question before he did. My mother. He came into the garden then, committed to it, with the air of a man crossing a threshold he'd been avoiding, and stood beside her at the pergola. The roses arched above them, blousy and extravagant. She planted the first ones when she married my father and moved here. She added to them every year. He reached out and touched a bloom, red, almost black at the centre, very briefly, with one finger. She said a garden was the only honest autobiography. Sofia was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. Past tense, clean and final. She died when I was 19. And your father kept the garden? Until he couldn't. Then no one did, exactly. He looked around at the magnificent, overgrown wildness of it. But nothing has been removed. They keep growing. She thought about what it would be like to live in a house full of the dead, her mother's roses, her father's books, her sister's portrait in the hall, and carry all of it forward without being crushed by the weight. Do you come in here often? She asked. He considered the question with his usual care. More recently, since Julia... He stopped. Julia, the sister. I find it easier to think here. She nodded. She didn't say, I understand, because she didn't, not really, not in the way that counted. But she felt the shape of it, the gravity of what he carried, and she thought that the distance he kept between himself and the world was not coldness. It was load-bearing. It was structural. I won't come in here if you'd rather I didn't, she said. He looked at her for a moment, that assessing, careful look, the one that felt like being read. Stay, he said, if you like. He began to appear in the rose garden in the mornings after that, not immediately, not the next day, when she went back alone and spent an hour learning the geometry of the plantings, discovering that there was actually a pattern to it if you looked closely, concentric circles radiating from the pergola, each ring a different colour. But the day after that, he came in when she was already there and said nothing, just walked the perimeter slowly, while she sat on the old iron bench near the south wall. And they were together, without being together, which was a form of company she hadn't known she needed. They began to talk, not about the situation, not about poison or power, or the fact that she was here against her will, but about other things, the small and large things that people talk about when they are thrown together by circumstance and discover, against all expectation, that they have words for each other. He had studied economics at Bologna, had spent 2 years in London working in, he was careful about the details here, finance. Had come home at 30 to help his father, and had stayed because Sicily pulled at him in a way that London never had, even when staying was difficult, even when difficult was a profound understatement. What was it like? She asked. Coming back, taking over. Impossible, he said, with the simplicity of someone who has had a long time to arrive at the word. My father was a man people feared. I had to become a man people feared. And I was 25 when I started the process, and I made many mistakes before I understood the difference between fear and respect. What's the difference? He was quiet for a moment, turning a fallen rose stem in his hands. Fear lasts as long as the threat. Respect survives the person who earned it. She thought about that. And which did your father have? Both, he said, at different times, from different people. He set down the stem. I try for only one. Respect. Yes, he looked at her, though I understand that from where you're standing, as my involuntary guest, that distinction may be difficult to appreciate. You're not wrong about that, she said, but she said it without bitterness, because she was discovering that bitterness required a kind of sustained antagonism she couldn't entirely maintain in his presence, and she found this simultaneously reassuring and alarming. She told him about Baltimore, about the specific texture of emergency medicine, the way time worked differently in a trauma bay, thicker, more granular, every second distinct. About Iraq and the particular silence of a field hospital in the night, the stars visible through the tent flap, the sounds that came in from outside that you learned to stop categorizing after a while. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Yes, constantly." "But fear is information," she said. "It tells you what to pay attention to." He looked at her steadily. "I think you may be the bravest person who has ever been in this garden." She laughed, and the sound surprised her. She hadn't expected it to come out so freely, so naturally. "I'm not brave. I'm just bad at stopping." "That," he said quietly, looking back at the roses, "is the definition of brave." On the 7th day, someone tried to kill him again. Sofia was in the library when she heard it. Not the shot itself, which came from the eastern perimeter and was a single, clean sound that the hills returned as a murmur, but the aftermath. The sudden, purposeful movement of men through the hallways, the controlled urgency of voices communicating in Sicilian dialect through earpieces, the change in the pressure of the house itself, that particular shift in atmosphere that meant the world outside had intruded and everything was calibrating to a new threat. She went to the hallway, and Concetta appeared immediately, with the expression of someone who had lived through many emergencies and had learned not to run. "Stay in your room," Concetta said. "Is he stay in your room, please?" And then, reading whatever was in Sofia's face, "He is not hurt. Sniper, eastern wall. Our men are dealing with it." Sofia went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, listened to the sounds of the house reorganizing itself around a threat, and thought, this is what his life is. Not this house, not the roses, not the library and the long dinners and the mornings in the garden. This is the infrastructure beneath everything else. He came to her room 2 hours later. She was still sitting on the bed. She'd tried to read and given up, and he knocked, which she hadn't expected, and came in when she said yes, and he looked the way she imagined a man looked after 2 hours of what had clearly been a significant operational response, controlled, precise, and carrying something tight in the set of his jaw. "You're all right," she said. "I am. They told me sniper, eastern wall." She looked at him. "Do you know who?" He crossed the room and stood at the window with his back to her. And the moonlight made him look like the portrait in the hallway, the same quality of weight, the same refusal of ease. "I have a suspicion." "The same person who poisoned you?" "Yes." She waited. "They missed," he said quietly. "The angle was wrong. My second moved me in time." He paused. "Marco has been with me for 12 years. She understood what he wasn't saying. In a circle where someone was compromised, Marco was still Marco. The relief of that was audible even through his control. "Come, sit down," she said. He turned, looked at her. "You've just been shot at," she said patiently. "You should sit down. Your cortisol is spiking. Your hands are probably steadier than they should be, which means your body is managing the adrenaline and will crash later. And you're standing at the window, which is a tactically poor choice given the evening's events." The look on his face was extraordinary. She thought, no one talks to him like this. No one tells him to sit down. He sat down. Not on the chair by the window. He sat at the foot of her bed, leaving a careful distance between them, and the intimacy of it was so quiet and so complicated that Sofia simply let it be what it was, rather than trying to name it. "Tell me about your training program," he said. "What you were supposed to be doing this week." She understood immediately what he was doing. The same technique she used with patients in shock, the redirection to the ordinary, the anchor of mundane detail. She let him use it. She told him about the cooperative clinic, about the fieldwork and the lectures, about the colleague from Oslo who ate lunch at 11 every morning and called it early lunch with absolute conviction, about the language gap that kept producing unintentionally hilarious misunderstandings. She talked until she felt the tension in the room ease slightly, until she heard his breathing even out. "You miss it," he said. "I miss useful," she said. "I miss having a function." He was quiet for a moment. "You have a function here." "I saved your life. That was a function I was happy to perform. Being decorative is not a function. You're not here to be decorative." He said it with a sharpness that surprised her. "I didn't bring you here as—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm sorry, that's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He looked at her for a long time. In the quiet of her room, with the moonlight through the shutters casting bars of light across the floor, he looked at her with those dark eyes that held too many things for her to catalogue, and he said, "I'm not sure I know any more." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she preferred not to examine too closely. "Who was Julia?" she asked. A pivot, deliberate, necessary. His jaw tightened, but he didn't shut her out. That was the thing she was learning about him. He decided what to let in and what to keep out, and once he'd decided, the decision held. "My sister. Younger by 6 years. She was—" He searched for it. "She was the part of this family that wasn't this. That wasn't any of what this is. She wanted to be a painter. She lived in Rome. He stopped again. "She was used to send me a message by a man who wanted my position, and I destroyed that man utterly. And she is still dead." Sofia didn't say she was sorry. Sorry was too small and too distant for what he was describing. She said, "Tell me what she was like." And the thing that happened to his face then, the careful, contained, load-bearing armour of it, shifted just enough for her to see what was underneath. It was terrible and beautiful, that glimpse, the way all genuine grief is when it finally surfaces. He told her about Julia. On the 9th day, she lost her temper. It had been building, she supposed, the particular pressure of confinement, of controlled communication, of being permitted a monitored phone call to her program supervisor in which she recited the story they'd agreed upon, a family emergency, a distant aunt in the Sicilian interior, so sorry for the disruption, she would return in a few days, and listened to the concern in Dr. Ferrara's voice, and had to keep her own voice steady through the lie, which felt like holding her breath under water. She had also received a text from her mother that morning. "Haven't heard from you in 4 days, Sofia. Just text me back so I know you're alive." Which she was, technically, and which was a distinction she had to remind herself of, because everything about her mother's message tasted like guilt. She texted back, "I'm fine, Mama. Busy with the program. I'll call Sunday." Then she went looking for Dante, because she needed to say something difficult, and she needed to say it before the pressure of it became explosive. She found him in the room she was not supposed to enter. She had not planned this. The western wing's door was usually closed, and she had respected that, had catalogued it as a boundary and honoured it, because she was a professional and she understood boundaries. But today the door was open, and she walked through it without entirely thinking, and found herself in a room that stopped her completely. It was large, and it was clearly a working room of some kind, not an office like the ground floor one, but something more operational, with screens on the wall showing security feeds, and what appeared to be a live map of Palermo, marked with locations she couldn't interpret, and a long table covered in documents and photographs. Several men were in the room. Men she'd seen on the grounds, Marco among them, and every one of them went still when she entered. And the stillness had a particular quality to it, the quality of people who had never expected this specific scenario. Dante was at the table. He looked up and saw her, and something moved through his face that was too quick for her to catch. Sofia. Quiet. Warning. "I'm sorry," she said. "The door was open. She looked around the room, at the photographs on the table, the ones she was now close enough to see. They were surveillance photos. Men in restaurants, men getting into cars, men standing outside buildings she didn't recognize. And in the center of the table, a photograph of her. Her. Taken on a street in Palermo 3 weeks ago. Before any of this, before the broken heel, before the courtyard, before any of it. She looked at Dante. He said something to his men, a brief phrase in dialect, and they filed out. Only Marco remained, standing near the door with his arms folded and his eyes professionally blank. "You were watching me before the courtyard," she said. He didn't deny it. "No. That photograph is from a general surveillance sweep. We were monitoring an area, not you specifically." He held her gaze. "You were incidental. And yet here we are." She felt the anger arrive properly then, not the hot, reactive kind, but the cold, clear kind that she'd learned to watch for in herself, because when she got like this, she was capable of saying things that were entirely true and completely irrevocable. "You're keeping my family in the dark. You're keeping my colleagues in the dark. You have a photograph of me from before I even knew you existed, and you're asking me to, what? Trust you? Accept the situation? I'm asking you to be patient." Patient. The word came out with a precision she didn't entirely intend. "I've been in your house for 9 days, Dante. I've been patient. I've been understanding. I've tried very hard to see your situation as you've presented it, because I believe that's fair, and I don't want to be the kind of person who can't see past their own resentment." She crossed her arms. "But I have a mother who is worried about me. I have a life in Boston. I have a return flight that is now," she did the math, 5 days away, which means if I'm not on it, I'll need to explain to an airline and probably an embassy what happened, and I don't think that serves either of us. Silence. Marco existed very quietly near the door. Dante put down whatever he had been holding. He came around the table toward her, and she held her ground, which she could tell surprised him. "You're right," he said. This was not what she had expected. "Everything you've said is right," he continued. "I know this. I'm asking you to accept an injustice because the alternative is a risk I don't know how to calculate." He stopped a few feet from her. This close, she could see the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the toll of 9 days of hunting whoever was hunting him, the cost of maintaining control when everything around him was uncertain. "I am trying to move faster. I need you to know that." "I believe you," she said, because she did, and it irritated her that she did. "But believing you doesn't make it easier." "No." He looked at her. Not the assessing look, not the careful, strategic look, but something more direct than those. Something that felt like he was setting down a weight. "Tell me what would help." She thought about it. "Let me work," she said. "I'm not suited for enforced leisure. If there's someone on your staff who needs medical attention, a consultation, anything, let me do something useful. I'll lose my mind otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Concetta's husband. He's at the house, retired now, lives in the cottage near the eastern wall. He has a bad hip that 3 different doctors have told him 3 different things about." "That's what I'm here for," she said. "I'll arrange it." She turned to go. At the door, she stopped, because there was one more thing, and it was the kind of thing she wouldn't be able to leave alone. "The photograph," she said without turning around. "The one of me on the table. Did you look at it before the courtyard? Did you know what I looked like before you saw me kneel down next to you?" The pause, long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Yes," he said. She nodded. Left, without looking back. Later, lying in the dark of her room with the nightjars outside and the scent of the orange grove drifting in through the cracked shutters, she thought about what it meant that he'd kept the photograph on the table. Not filed away, not in a folder, in the centre of the operational map of his world. She thought about it for a long time. Enzo Brancati was 73, formidable in the manner of all men who had once been powerful and had retained the memory of it in their bodies, even as the bodies argued back. And he received Sofia's knock on the cottage door with the wariness of someone who had been told many different things about the new resident in the big house. "Concetta said you were a nurse," he said, in Sicilian-accented Italian that required her full attention to pass. "American," she said. "Emergency medicine. Your hip. Has anyone looked at your gait pattern, not just the imaging?" He blinked. "No." "May I watch you walk?" 20 minutes of patient observation and targeted questioning produced the preliminary conclusion that Enzo's hip pain was less a hip problem than a compensation pattern originating from a long-ago knee injury that had never been properly rehabilitated, that he had been walking asymmetrically for so many years that the resulting load on his hip joint had produced the arthritis that 3 doctors had been treating as the cause rather than the effect. She explained this carefully. He listened with the initial skepticism of a man who had been told conflicting things by credentialed people and had decided that credentials were a form of theatre. And then with something more open as she went on, as the logic of it made visible sense to him, as she demonstrated the compensation pattern in his own body by having him stand first on one leg, then the other, and feel the difference. "I can't fix the arthritis," she said, "but I can give you exercises that will reduce the load. 6 weeks, consistent. You'll know in 3 if it's working." He looked at her for a long moment. "My wife said you saved Signor Ricci's life." "I helped. He did the rest." "Signor Ricci does not ask for help," Enzo said, with the precision of someone making an important distinction. "He is not a man who asks." Sofia thought about this. No, he doesn't ask. He receives it when it's offered. Enzo nodded slowly. You understand him? I'm working on it. She wrote out the exercises in careful Italian on the back of a piece of paper Enzo produced from a kitchen drawer, made him walk through each one while she observed the form, and left with the feeling she'd been missing for 9 days. The clean satisfaction of having done something that would make a real difference to a real person. Dante was waiting when she came out of the cottage, not waiting in an obvious way. He was standing some distance away in the shade of an orange tree, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the cottage door. And she thought, he was there the whole time. He was close enough to hear any sound that might suggest trouble. She crossed the gravel to him. Did you think I was going to run? The eastern wall is 200 meters in that direction, he nodded. The security is substantial, but not impenetrable. But you thought I wouldn't. He looked at her. I hoped. She walked beside him back toward the house, and the afternoon light lay long and amber across the gravel, and the orange trees smelled of leaves and bark rather than blossom in this part of the day. She was close enough to him that she could feel the warmth he gave off, that particular warmth of a living body that was, she was beginning to understand, almost always present to her now. The way you became attuned to a sound after you'd listened for it long enough. Tell me what you know about who's doing this, she said. Sofia, I'm not asking for state secrets. I'm asking because I've been thinking about what I told you the first night, about the compound being designed for interrogation. And I've been thinking that whoever did this is not trying to replace you. They're trying to find something. Information. He slowed, looked at her sideways. Go on. If they wanted you dead, the sniper would have been better positioned. The poison would have been a lethal dose. But both attempts have had a quality of incompletion, like they need something from you before they can finish it. She paused. What do you know that someone wants badly enough to burn through this much operational cost? The silence stretched between them. 3 years ago, he said finally, I made an agreement with 3 families, Calabrian, Neapolitan, and Palomitan. The agreement restructured the distribution network for a significant portion of the region's commerce. He glanced at her. You understand what I'm telling you without telling you. Drug traffic, she said simply. The terms of that agreement were never committed to paper. They exist only in the minds of the 4 principals. He paused. 2 of those principals are now dead. One, a man named Corsetti from Naples, has been making moves that suggest he intends to renegotiate by force. His jaw tightened. But to do that, he needs to know what I know, the specifics, the exact terms, because without them, he cannot leverage the other parties. He's trying to extract the agreement from you. Yes. Which is why you're still alive. Sofia thought this through. He needs you alive long enough to get the information. After that, yes, he said again very quietly. She absorbed this. They had stopped walking. They were standing in the middle of the gravel path, with the orange trees on either side and the house before them. And the gravity of what she was standing in the middle of made itself fully felt for the first time. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer me honestly. I will try. Am I in danger? He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the honesty and the calculation move through his face in sequence. The man he was made of competing considerations, and she watched the honesty win. Corsetti doesn't know you're here, he said. As far as the outside world is concerned, you are at a family emergency in the interior. So no, not directly, not yet. A pause. But I will not tell you that this situation carries no risk. I think you deserve better than that lie. Thank you, she said, for the honesty. He nodded once. In that case, she said, you'd better find Corsetti quickly, because I have 5 days until my flight, and I intend to be on it. She walked back to the house. He stayed on the gravel path, watching her go, and she felt his gaze between her shoulder blades, like the warmth she was getting too accustomed to. She woke at 2 in the morning on the 11th day to the sound of a piano. For a moment she lay still in the dark, listening, uncertain if it was a dream. She had been dreaming about the cooperative clinic, about the long, bright corridors and the smell of antiseptic, and the particular satisfaction of things in their right places. But the piano continued, low and searching, coming up through the floors and through the walls, and it was not the music of a dream. She got up and put on the cotton robe Concetta had provided, and followed the sound down the stairs, through the main hall and past the library, to a room she had assumed was another sitting room, a room with tall double doors that stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, darkness, and the shine of moonlight on something large, and the music. She pushed the door open. The room was a music room. Not surprising, she supposed, in a house this old, and this intentional. But she hadn't found it yet in her explorations. It held the piano, which was an old Bösendorfer, and a cello stand with no cello, and several high-backed chairs that had been moved back toward the walls. The moonlight came in through 3 tall windows and fell across the piano and the man at it. He hadn't heard her. He was playing with his eyes closed, and the music he was playing— she placed it after a moment— Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major, was being played with the particular focus of someone who had gone somewhere else, somewhere the music lived and the rest of the world did not. Sofia stood in the doorway and didn't move. She had known many people in her life who were technically proficient at things. What she was watching was not that. What she was watching was someone for whom music was load-bearing in the same way the rose garden was, the way the library was. A structure that held something in him that would otherwise fall. The nocturne ended, and he went directly into something else, something quieter and slower, and entirely his own, she thought. Nothing she recognized, a melody that moved in intervals that felt like questions asked of an empty room. She made a small sound. He stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned on the bench and saw her in the doorway, and the expression on his face in that first, unguarded second was the most intimate thing she had seen from him, the most vulnerable, before the armor found its way back into place. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. The sound was coming up through the house." "Don't apologize," he said. His voice was different at 2 in the morning. Something in it had come loose. She came in. She sat in one of the high-backed chairs near the piano, tucking her feet up beneath her, and looked at him across the Bösendorfer. "I didn't know you played." "There's a great deal you don't know about me." "That's true," she said, "and considerably less than there was 11 days ago." She held his gaze. "Who taught you?" "My mother. Piano, specifically. My father thought it was indulgent. He believed in utility, in things that served a direct purpose." A pause. He was not an entirely wrong man, but he was wrong about some things. She thought about the man in the hall portrait. "And yet you still play." At 2 in the morning, alone, something rueful in it. I'm not sure that counts as defiance. It counts as continuity, she said. You're keeping something alive. He looked at her. The moonlight was generous and merciless in equal measure. It showed her the lines of his face, the fatigue she'd learnt to look for, the thing in his eyes that was always there, burning and controlled, and which she was running out of words to describe because the words she was arriving at were ones she wasn't ready to use. "Play something else," she said. He turned back to the piano. He played for a long time, another nocturne, and then something from Debussy that felt like water, and then a piece she didn't recognize that was melancholy in a way that had earned itself, that had suffered its way to what it was, rather than performing sadness. And Sofia sat in the high-backed chair in the moonlit room and listened, and felt the peculiar unwinding of something in her chest that she'd been carrying coiled tight for so long she'd stopped noticing the tension. When he stopped, finally, the silence was a different quality of silence from before. "Tell me about Boston," he said without turning around. "The real thing, not the facts." She thought about it. "It's grey, a lot. I used to mind that. Now I find it honest. The city doesn't pretend to be what it isn't." She paused. "I have an apartment near the hospital. It has a window that faces a parking garage, which is less romantic than it sounds." He made a small sound, almost a laugh. "I grow things on the windowsill," she continued. "Herbs, mostly. It's very small scale as gardens go. Rosemary and basil, and last year a tomato plant that produced exactly 3 tomatoes and then died of what I can only describe as spite." He turned on the bench then and looked at her, and he was almost smiling. And the almost was doing things to the atmosphere in the room that Sofia chose to observe from a clinical distance. "You'll go back to it," he said, "the parking garage and the windowsill herbs." "Yes." He held her gaze. "Do you want to?" She should have said yes immediately, easily, without hesitation. She had a life in Boston. She had her apartment and her hospital and her mother in Providence who called twice a week, and friends from nursing school and a gym membership she used every other morning. The reliable geography of a life she'd built carefully and sensibly. "I want to go home," she said, which was the truest answer she had, and which was not the same as answering his question, and they both knew it. He nodded, turned back to the piano, played one more piece very quietly, and she fell asleep in the high-backed chair while he played, and did not wake until Concetta found her there at 6 in the morning with a blanket she didn't remember being covered with. On the 12th day, everything accelerated. Marco came to the dining room at breakfast with the particular expression that Sofia was learning to recognize, the expression of controlled urgency, of news that required action but was being held briefly in check by the presence of the person who was not supposed to be there. "I can leave," Sofia said immediately. "Stay," Dante said, without inflection. Marco looked at him. A brief exchange of something wordless passed between them, 12 years of working together compressed into a half-second of eye contact, and then Marco spoke. The man was Corsetti's second, a Neapolitan named Ferrante, who had been identified on a surveillance feed at Palermo's port. He had arrived by private vessel. He was not travelling alone. And this was the information that changed the shape of the room. He had been photographed meeting with a man named Vitale, who was one of Dante's own lieutenants, and who had been in the courtyard the night of the poisoning. Vitale. Sofia watched Dante receive this information, watched the very precise, very contained way it landed in him, like a stone dropping into still water, the surface disturbance minimal, the depth of impact impossible to gauge from the outside. She thought, he suspected it already. She thought, it is a different thing to suspect and to know. Where is Vitale now? Dante said. At his apartment in the city, under observation. Marco paused. He doesn't know we know. Keep it that way. A pause. I want to understand the full arrangement before we move. He looked at Marco steadily. And I want Ferrante's location confirmed before nightfall. Yes. Marco glanced at Sofia once more, then left. The room settled into a silence that had specific weight. How long had Vitale been with you? Sofia asked. 8 years. Dante's voice was exactly level. He was there when my father died. He helped me in the transition. He picked up his espresso, did not drink from it, put it down. He was the one who found Julia. She went very still. Oh. Yes. The word was so controlled, it was almost colourless. Oh. She understood now the particular quality of the betrayal, not just the professional treachery of a man in a position of trust, but something layered and old and intimate beneath it. A man who had stood at her brother's side in the worst moments and had perhaps been building toward this from the very beginning. I'm sorry, she said. He looked up. She never said she was sorry. She'd learned early that sorry was often a way of stepping back from pain rather than toward it, a verbal reflex that provided comfort to the speaker more than the recipient. But this specific sorry, for this specific thing, in this specific moment, was the only available word. He nodded once. It landed differently than if he'd dismissed it. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, I let Corsetti believe his move is working. I let Ferrante and Vitale think they have more time. He finally picked up the espresso and this time drank it. And in 24 hours, I finish this. And after that? He looked at her across the breakfast table with its white linen and its silver coffee pot and the morning light coming in at a low angle that caught the planes of his face and made him look, for a moment, like the portrait and the man and the ghost of his father all at once. After that, he said, your flight. The words settled between them like something falling from a height. Neither of them moved. Right, she said. He was gone most of the day. She spent it in the rose garden and then the library, and she was aware throughout of the movement of men through the house, of phone calls and the low, constant communication of the security team. And the mansion felt different, coiled, purposeful, no longer a refuge from something, but the origin point of something. She was at the window of the library in the late afternoon when Marco appeared in the doorway. He wanted you to know, Marco said in Italian, that there will be movement tonight. The house is secure. You are not in danger. He paused. He said you would worry. She turned to look at him. He had a quiet face, Marco. The face of a man who had made his choices long ago and carried them without drama. She thought about what it meant, that he had thought to send this message, that he knew she would worry, that he had anticipated this specific need in her across the considerable distance of whatever was consuming him today. Is he going himself? she asked. Marco was quiet for 1 second too long. Marco? He is not someone who directs from a distance, the man said carefully, on matters of this significance. She turned back to the window. The orange grove was going dark in the early evening, the trees becoming shapes and shadows, the scent intensifying as it always did at dusk. She thought about him out there in the Palermo night, in the Sicilian dark, confronting the shape of the betrayal that had been growing in his house for however long. "Tell him to be careful," she said. Another pause. "He will not like hearing that." "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." He came back at 4 in the morning. She heard the car, heard it without meaning to, because she hadn't been sleeping, had been lying in the dark with a book propped on her chest that she hadn't read a word of for 2 hours, listening to the house and the night and her own thoughts. She heard him on the stairs. His step was distinctive. She knew it now, that particular economy of movement, nothing wasted. She got up. She met him in the hallway outside his room, which was 2 doors down from hers, and the look on his face when he saw her standing there, barefoot in the robe, clearly having waited, was the most complex thing she had ever seen on a human face, and she had seen people in extremis, people at the furthest edge of what a person could endure and still be themselves. And nothing had prepared her for the specific quality of the look he gave her. He was uninjured. She checked, professionally, immediately, the nurse's eye tracking for blood, for irregular posture, for the held-in stillness of someone managing pain. Nothing. He was whole. He was also shattered in some interior way that didn't show on the surface except in the very slight raggedness at the edge of his control. "Done?" she asked. "Done," he said. She nodded. He reached up and loosened his collar, and she saw his hand was not quite steady, and she thought, the adrenaline wearing off, the cost of whatever the night had required of him, the settling of the bones after a reckoning. "The kitchen," she said. "Come on. Sofia, you need to eat something. Your blood sugar is probably—" She looked at him and changed course. "You need to not be alone right now. Come to the kitchen." He came. She made eggs, scrambled with the rosemary from the kitchen garden, the way her Italian grandmother had made them on winter mornings in Providence, and she poured him a glass of water and then a small glass of wine, because sometimes the clinical decision and the human decision were the same, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table while he ate, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not empty, but full of the night and what it had contained, and the slow returning of things to their proper temperature. "Vitale is in custody," he said, when the plate was half empty. "Ferrante has gone back to Naples, which is a diplomatic gesture, the Neapolitan family's way of saying Corsetti acted without their sanction." He paused. "Whether that's true is another question." "And Corsetti himself?" A beat. "Corsetti has been persuaded that his interests are better served by the original agreement." She didn't ask what persuaded had involved. Some things were clinical facts, and some things were things you let exist in the language you'd been given them in. "So it's over," she said. "This part." He looked up. "There's always another part." "Is that sustainable, living like this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I've never considered the alternative." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." He set down his fork. "Before I came back here, before my father died, I used to think about other lives, London, finance, a life that wasn't... He gestured, encompassing the house, the history, the weight of everything. But Sicily doesn't let its children go entirely, and this family... A pause. There's no one else. If I leave, there's no one left to hold what my grandfather built, what my father held, what Julia... He stopped. What Julia died for? She said gently. The muscle in his jaw worked. Yes. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at this man who was the last of something, who was holding a dying empire together with his bare hands, and his silence, and his rose garden, and his Chopin at 2 in the morning, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not clinical and not professional, and was not going to be named tonight, or possibly ever if she had anything to say about it. "You should sleep," she said. "Yes." Neither of them moved immediately. "Sofia." His voice was different, still controlled, but the control had changed its quality, had become something chosen rather than automatic. "Thank you for being here. I'm aware that's..." He stopped. "I'm aware of the inadequacy of saying it." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just sleep." She stood up. He stood up. They were very close together in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, close enough that she could see the dark circles under his eyes and the shadow of his jaw and the particular quality of exhaustion that was more than physical. And she thought, if I touch him right now, I will not be able to maintain the fiction that this is anything other than what it is. She stepped back. "Good night, Dante." "Good night," he said. His eyes followed her all the way out of the kitchen, and she felt them, step by step, like warmth on her back in a cold room. 3 days. 3 days until her flight. She could count them now on her fingers, could hold the number in her hand and feel its weight, which was considerable and getting heavier. She booked the flight again online, which she had been doing every few days like a ritual, refreshing the confirmation email, reading the departure gate and terminal information, as if she might forget them, as if reading them often enough would make them real. Palermo to Boston, via Rome. 14 hours. Then the taxi from Logan through the tunnel, the familiar particular smell of the city in October, her apartment, the window that faced the parking garage, the windowsill herbs. She was on the east-facing balcony of the 2nd floor with her phone and her coffee when Dante found her that morning. He came to the doorway and leaned against the frame rather than coming out. She had noticed he did this, occupied doorways in a way that was neither inside nor outside, present but not committed, which she thought said something considerable about how he navigated the world. He had a different quality this morning. Some of the weight of the previous week had lifted, and what remained was something, she looked at him and thought, lighter. Still contained, still carrying everything he always carried, but somehow with less friction, as if the resolution of the immediate threat had freed some mechanism she hadn't known was bound. "You've booked it again," he said, nodding at her phone. She didn't ask how he knew. His people monitored the internet. Presumably booking an airline seat fell within that purview. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Good. The word landed wrong, not in the meaning but in the delivery, with a flatness that was conspicuously neutral, the kind of neutral that takes effort. "What do you need from me before I go?" she said. "Nothing." "Dante, nothing official." He pushed off the doorframe and came out onto the balcony then, coming to stand beside her at the rail. The morning was brilliant, the sea just visible over the hills and the citrus groves, the sky the colour of something that had no word in English, but which the Sicilians might have named in one of the dialects she was still piecing together. I need nothing from you officially. Formally, whatever word makes the boundary clear. A pause. You were a complication that I turned into a... I had no right to what these 2 weeks have been. She turned to look at him. You didn't manufacture them. I kept you here. You had reasons. Yes, and I also had... He stopped, started again, with the careful precision of someone who has thought about the right words for days and is still not sure they're right. You came into a courtyard and saved my life, and you asked nothing for it, and I responded by taking away your freedom. And somewhere, in the middle of that, What has happened in the last 2 weeks is not something I planned or intended or... Dante. She said his name and the careful words stopped, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that were burning in the Sicilian morning, burning steadily as they always did, and she thought, this is the most dangerous thing. Not the guns and the poison and the men in the dark with the earpieces. This. I know. Do you? She held his gaze. I know what this is. I know what it has been. I know what it can't be, practically and realistically, because I have a life in Boston, and you have a life here that is... She searched for it. Particular, in a way that doesn't easily accommodate someone like me. He was very still. Someone like you. A nurse from Rhode Island with no particular interest in organized crime. She said it without cruelty, but without softening, because she thought he deserved clarity. Someone who came to Sicily for 6 weeks and is going home when the 6 weeks are done. Yes, he said, all of that is true. The morning held them there for a moment. A bird started up somewhere in the orange grove, some rapid, insistent call. I want to show you something, he said. Tonight, before... He stopped. Tonight, if you're willing. She should have said no. The sensible, careful, clearly thought-through answer was no. But she was in Sicily, and Sicily kept making sensible feel like a synonym for small, and she looked at his face in the brilliant morning light, and she said, yes. He took her to Palermo, which she had not expected. She had thought the gardens, the rose garden maybe, something contained within the walls. But at 8 in the evening Marco brought a car around, and Dante, in a dark suit that was somehow more elegant than anything she'd seen him in, came to find her and said, come. She wore the one dress she had that was not clinical. A dark blue thing she'd packed for the possibility of evenings in the city during the training program, draped and simple, the colour of the sea at dusk. Concetta had produced earrings, which Sofia suspected were Concetta's own, and she'd done something to her dark hair that she thought would hold for maybe an hour in the Sicilian night air. When she came down the stairs, he was waiting at the bottom, and the look on his face when he saw her, the very precise, very controlled moment in which something in him recalibrated, was not clinical, not strategic, not the assessing look she knew. It was simply a man looking at a woman, and everything that contained. Palermo at night was a different city from Palermo at dusk. The streets had a current in them, a live, insistent energy, people emerging from the dark interiors of buildings the way summer comes out of itself, sudden and irresistible. He walked beside her through the Calça district, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, not touching, but proximate in a way that felt entirely intentional. And the men who materialized at the edges of their path, his men, she understood, Marco among them at a distance, were invisible to everyone but her. He took her to a place she would not have found alone. A courtyard restaurant accessed through an archway she would have walked past a dozen times without noticing it was there, where the tables were under lemon trees, and the lighting was candles in old wine bottles, and the food arrived without menus, because there were no menus, because Salvatore, who cooked and who embraced Dante with the unself-conscious warmth of a man who had fed him for 20 years, knew what to bring. "My father brought me here when I was 15, Dante said, while they were waiting for the food. It was the first time he took me to the city as—" a slight pause, "as his son who would inherit, not as a child, as a successor." He looked at the courtyard, at the lemon trees and the other tables and the warm, imperfect light. "He ordered for both of us without asking me what I wanted, which annoyed me considerably." "And now you order without menus." He looked at her. "I called Salvatore yesterday and asked him to prepare what you would like." She stared at him. "You asked him? But I've never— He doesn't know me." "He knows what people like who eat the food they grew up eating, and what people like who are discovering new things, and the difference between the two. I told him which you were." He held her gaze, unsmiling, direct. "Was I wrong?" She thought about what her first weeks in Palermo had tasted like, the capitonata at the small place near the clinic, which she'd ordered a second time the next day, and a third time 2 days after that, the arancini from the vendor near the cathedral, the particular sweetness of the local seafood. "No," she said, "you weren't wrong." When the food came, it was extraordinary. Not elaborate, not theatrical, but exactly the food that Sicily was in its best self. Caponata and fresh pasta with urchin and swordfish in the old Palamitan style, and bread that made her close her eyes involuntarily, and wine that tasted like the hills it came from. They talked for 3 hours. The food became incidental to the talking. The food became the structure that held the talking, and the talking was different tonight from all the talking that had come before it, because there was nothing to manage in it, nothing being calibrated or controlled. He told her things she suspected he told very few people, about the years after Julia, the specific silence of a house that had been 2 people and became 1. The work of rebuilding yourself from something that had been broken all the way down. "Do you think grief ends?" she asked. "I think it changes shape," he said, "from something sharp and urgent to something chronic, like your man Enzo's hip." He looked at her. "You learn to walk differently." She thought about her father, who had died when she was 23, early and badly, a cardiac event that had given no warning. "Yes," she said. Something passed between them in the lemon tree light, something old and real and human, the particular recognition of 2 people who have carried their losses to a table and set them down together. When they left the restaurant, it was after 11, and the city had gone into its second life, the one that started after 10 and ran until the small hours, all movement and music and the smell of burning espresso and something sweet she could never quite identify. He walked her through it without hurrying, and the men at the edges of the path were still there, invisible and vigilant, and she was aware of them and didn't care, because she was walking through Palermo at night with Dante Ricci, and the city was extraordinary, and so was he. At a corner near the waterfront, he stopped. She stopped beside him. They were looking at the harbour, the lights of it reflected in the dark water, the fishing boats rocking gently at their moorings. He was close enough that she could have turned and been in his arms without effort. The awareness of this was a physical fact, like temperature. "Sofia," he said. Not a question, just her name, held in his mouth like something he was deciding whether to say or keep. "Don't," she said, very quietly. "Not tonight." He was still for a moment. Then, "All right." They stood at the harbour and looked at the water, and did not touch, and it cost them both something, and the cost was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that comes from choosing rather than from having, and it was terrible and precise, and it was, she thought, exactly what they were to each other. 2 days before the flight, she woke with the particular clarity of someone who has slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in a long time, and lay in the white linen and listened to the orange grove and thought, "I have been happy here." The thought arrived without drama or revision, simply happy. Not uncomplicated. She had been a prisoner, technically, for most of it, had been lied to and surveilled and managed, had felt her real life receding behind her like a shore seen from a departing ship. And also happy. The rose garden in the mornings, and the library in the afternoons, and Enzo, whose hip was genuinely improving, who had shown up at her door the previous morning with a bag of oranges from the grove, and a dignity in the gesture that had nearly undone her. And Concetta, who communicated primarily through food, and who had pressed a small jar of preserved lemons into her hands yesterday, with an expression that said everything neither of them was willing to put into words. And Dante. She would not unspool that thread now. She would simply be here for 2 more days and be honest about what that meant and didn't mean. And then she would go, and she would carry it the way he'd described carrying grief, differently, with a new shape in her gait, but forward. She dressed and went down to the rose garden. He was already there. This was new. He was usually in his office in the early morning, in the operational centre of his world, and she had always had the garden to herself at this hour. But he was sitting on the old iron bench near the south wall, in his suit jacket with no tie, and he had a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold while he sat there not drinking it, and he looked like a man who had not slept at all. She sat beside him, not at a careful distance, beside him, close enough that their arms were almost touching. "You should have slept," she said. "I couldn't." She took the cold coffee from his hand and set it on the flagstone and put her hands in her lap and looked at the roses. The morning was pink and gold, and the birds were building their case for the day at full volume. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He was quiet for so long, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I'm thinking that I don't know how to do this correctly." "Do what?" "This." He gestured between them, not clumsily. He didn't do anything clumsily, but with a rawness that told her this was uncharted territory, that whatever maps he had for navigating the world, this was not on them. "I don't have I'm not a man with a template for this. My father's marriage was an arrangement. My one relationship that meant something was destroyed by this life before it began." He paused. "I don't know how to ask for something I have no right to ask for." "Then don't ask," she said. "Tell me what it is, and I'll tell you if I'd give it." The bird in the orange grove had been joined by several others. The garden smelled of dew and roses and the first warmth of the morning. "Stay," he said. "Not as a prisoner, not the way you've been here. Stay because you choose to." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were everything they always were, burning and dark, but stripped now of the last of the protective management, just the real thing, the man who lived under the armour. "I know what I'm asking. I know your life is in Boston. I know what this life is. I won't pretend otherwise. But I am asking." Sophia looked at him. She thought about the flight. She thought about the parking garage view and the windowsill herbs and her colleagues and her mother who called twice a week and the hospital corridors with their honest grey light. She thought about 9 years of a life carefully and sensibly built. "I have 2 more days," she said. "Let me think." He nodded once. It was not the answer he wanted, she could see that clearly, but he received it without alteration, without pushing, because he was a man who understood that some things couldn't be forced. "All right," he said. "All right." She looked at the roses. "Now drink your cold coffee and tell me about the one relationship that was destroyed. I want to know." He looked at her, surprised. "You brought it up," she said. "I'm a nurse. I follow the symptom." A sound escaped him, definitely a laugh this time, shorter than the one in the dining room, but just as real. He picked up the cold coffee. Her name was Mara. She was Milanese, architect. He looked into the cup. She was intelligent and principled, and she did not know what I was when we met. And when she found out, she chose correctly. Chose correctly how? She left. No bitterness, just fact. She left, and I understood, and I didn't try to change her mind. Sophia thought about this. Because you knew she was right. Because I loved her enough to know she was right. He looked up from the coffee. That's the distinction I've been living in ever since. The distinction between loving someone enough to let them go and being incapable of asking them to stay. She heard it in what he hadn't said and thought, and here we are, at the edge of the same distinction. "I'll think," she said again. "I know," he said. They sat in the rose garden while the morning arrived fully, gold and pink going white and clear, and the birds made their case, and the roses held their colour in the climbing light, and they sat close enough that their arms were touching, without either of them having moved to make it so. She spent the following day in a state of sustained internal negotiation. She walked the perimeter of the grounds. She sat in the library and did not read. She went to see Enzo, who showed her his exercises with the pride of a man who had discovered something true about his own body and appreciated it. And she adjusted the third exercise and explained why, and he nodded with the gravity of someone receiving important information. She called her mother from the monitored phone, Sofia Caruso, who had raised one daughter and one son in Providence, Rhode Island, on strong coffee and stronger opinions, was not a woman who could be managed in conversation, and Sophia had spent 31 years trying, with only partial success. "You sound different," her mother said within the first 4 minutes. "I'm fine, Mama." "Different doesn't mean not fine. You sound—" A pause. The thoughtful kind, which was the most dangerous kind from Rosaria. "You sound like you're in the middle of something." I'm in the middle of a very lovely training program. Sofia Elena Caruso, I have known you since before you could speak, and you are in the middle of something that is not a training program. Another pause. Is there a man? She was sitting in the kitchen garden with the rosemary and the melissa, her face in the afternoon sun. You always ask that. I always ask that because the answer is usually interesting. A beat. Is it? It's complicated, Mama. All men are complicated. That's their primary characteristic. Her mother's voice shifted, softened, became the other voice, the one under the Providence practicality, the one that was 4 generations of Italian-American women who had known something about loving difficult things. But complications aren't reasons. Are you safe? Yes. Are you happy? The word her mother used was felice, happy. The same word that had arrived this morning in Sofia's head with such uncomplicated clarity. Yes, she said. Surprisingly. Then think carefully, her mother said, about what you're going back for and what you're leaving. She thought about it all afternoon. She thought about it with the clinical clarity she brought to differential diagnosis and the emotional clarity she brought to nothing at all, because emotional clarity was not her strong suit, and she knew it. She thought, Boston is real. My work is real. The people I help are real. The life I have there is made of real things. She thought, and so is this. She thought, but this is his world. The guns and the power and the men in the shadows and the phone calls at midnight and the cost of what he is. I know what the cost is now. I have seen it in his face when he talks about Julia. I have seen it in the operation of this house, the constant vigilance of it, the way life here is conducted behind armour and stone walls, and the management of threats. She thought, but I have also seen the rose garden, and the piano at 2 in the morning, and the cold coffee he didn't drink because he was too busy sitting with the morning and whatever he couldn't stop thinking about. She thought, Mara was right to leave, and she was also right to have loved him. She went to his office at 6 in the evening. She knocked. He said, "Come in." He was at his desk, and he looked up, and whatever was in her face told him something, because he was still, for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how to receive whatever was coming. "I'm going to go home," she said. He nodded once. "I'm going to go home, and I'm going to get on the flight, and I'm going to go back to Boston and the parking garage and the windowsill rosemary." She came into the room and stood before the desk. "Because it's mine, and I built it, and I should go back to it before I make any decision about anything." He was watching her with absolute attention. "And then," she said, "I want you to call me. Not tonight, not next week. Give me a month. Give me real life and distance and whatever clarity comes from being home. And then call me." She held his gaze. "If you still want to." The silence stretched between them, and in it she could hear the complexity of what he was thinking. She could practically see it, the careful intelligence of him working through what she'd said, the hope he was controlling, the gratitude he wouldn't perform. "A month," he said. "Yes. And you'll answer." "I'll answer." He stood up from the desk, and she held her ground, and he came around it slowly and stopped with a foot of space between them, and he lifted his hand and touched her face. One touch, thumb along her cheekbone, brief and careful, and everything. Everything. and said, "Go home, Sofia Caruso." She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 2 weeks. "I'll be in touch," she said. "I know you will," he said. And the certainty in it, the quiet, absolute certainty, settled in her chest like roots finding water. The last morning was a quiet thing. She had packed the night before, her notebooks and her broken heel, and the clothes she'd arrived with, augmented now by a few things Concetta had quietly produced over the past 2 weeks. The cotton robe, a silk scarf in the blue-green of the sea that she tried to return and Concetta refused with an expression that made argument impossible. The small jar of preserved lemons, and, wrapped carefully in a piece of tissue that Concetta had provided without being asked, a single dried rose, deep red, almost black at the centre from the rose garden's south wall. She had taken it herself the previous evening in the long golden light. She had sat with the permission of it, his permission, wordless and given in the simple fact of the unlocked door. And she had taken the one rose and thought about autobiography and what it meant to carry evidence of where you had been. Breakfast was at 7, and he was there, which he was not always, which told her that he had decided to be. They sat at the long table with its white linen and its silver coffee service and the morning light coming in at angles, and Concetta brought pastries and the particular almond cake that Sofia had discovered on her 4th day, and which she could not think about without the precise taste of it arriving in her mouth immediately. They ate and they talked. About the week's headlines, about something she had read in the library the day before, about the 3 tomatoes, and it was the most ordinary morning and the most particular morning, the specific morning that would be the last of its kind, and they both knew it. After breakfast he walked her to the car. Marco was there, and Concetta, and Enzo, who had come from the cottage with his better walk. Genuinely improved, measurably improved, the compensation pattern softening with each day of the exercises, and who shook her hand with both of his and said, in Sicilian too rapid for her to catch fully, something that she thought was about the kindness of strangers and how it confounded expectations. She embraced Concetta, which surprised the older woman into a moment of stillness before she returned it with the firm competence of a woman who expressed her feelings through action rather than words. Then she turned to Dante. He was standing by the car, with his hands loose at his sides, that uncharacteristic looseness, the armour off in the morning light. And he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, which was to say, with total attention, the whole burning weight of it. She crossed to him. She put her hand briefly on his chest, above his heart, flat-palmed, feeling the warmth of him through his shirt, and looked up at him, and she said, very quietly, "A month." "A month," he confirmed. She took her hand away, got in the car. She did not look back as they went down the drive, through the gates, out onto the road that wound down through the hills toward the coast. She looked forward, at the road and the morning, at the sea appearing and disappearing between the hills as the road bent and turned. She felt the distance opening between herself and the house with each kilometre. Not a tearing feeling, which was what she had braced for, but something more like a held breath, a suspension, a state between states. She had her flight. She had her home. She had a month, and then a phone call that might or might not come. She had the rose in her bag, wrapped in tissue. The airport was ordinary, and therefore extraordinary, after 2 weeks of the extraordinary as a baseline. The queues and the announcements and the smell of recycled air and fast food and jet fuel. Sofia stood in the line for security, and felt the ordinary world receiving her back, resuming its familiar geography around her, and she thought, "Here I am," and also, "There I was." The flight boarded on time. She found her seat, window, which she'd booked specifically so she could watch Sicily from above as they rose. She watched the island diminish, the mountains, the coast, the particular amber gold of the southern hills, the sea going from the deep turquoise of close water to the wide, flat blue of distance, and then just blue, and the island was gone. She pressed her hand flat to the window briefly. Then she opened the book she'd borrowed from the library, The Quiet American, which she'd never quite finished in the rose garden, which she'd taken with a note left on the desk saying, "I'll return it." And she read for the next 7 hours and thought about almost nothing else, which was the very best thing she could do. Boston in October was what Boston in October always was. Bright, sharp-edged, autumnal, with the particular energy of a city that has decided, collectively, that the end of warm weather is going to be beautiful rather than sad. The trees went red and gold, and the Charles reflected them, and Sofia walked across the river bridge on her first morning home and thought, "Yes, this is also real." She went back to work. The first day felt like putting on clothes she'd grown slightly too large for during the absence, and finding, somewhat to her surprise, that they still fit. The hospital corridors, the fluorescent light, the smell of antiseptic and coffee from the nurses' station, the specific timbre of a department managing multiple crises simultaneously. It all received her back without ceremony, which was exactly what she needed. She worked a 12-hour shift, 2 trauma cases and the cardiac event, and the ordinary tide of an emergency department. And she was good at her job, had always been good at her job. And by the end of the shift, she had remembered this clearly and felt it like solid ground beneath her. She called her mother on Sunday, as promised. "You look better," Rosaria said, studying her on the video call with the maternal X-ray that had never failed to find the truth of Sofia. "I feel better. Did you resolve your complication?" She thought about a month and a phone call and the rose pressed in the pages of a borrowed book. "Not yet," she said. "Give it time." She thought about him every day. She had anticipated this and had decided to allow it, which was a decision that required some effort to maintain, because she was also aware that thinking about Dante Ricci was not a neutral activity, was not the equivalent of thinking about a good book or a memorable meal, was something with momentum that accumulated interest. She thought about him in the morning when the windowsill herbs needed water. She thought about him at the hospital when she encountered a case that would have interested him. She had taken to noting what would interest him, as if she were keeping a list for a conversation that might or might not happen. She thought about him at night more insistently, with the particular quality of thought that comes when the careful management of the daytime has been relaxed. She did not think only about the charged moments, not only the harbour at night and the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the hand on her face at the end. She thought about the library and the roses and the eggs she'd scrambled and the Chopin floating up through the floors. She thought about Enzo's hip and Concetta's scarf. She thought about the shape of a family held together by one person's refusal to let it dissolve. She wrote to Concetta once, a brief note in Italian, thanking her for everything, which she sent through the monitored email address she'd been given. She received back 3 words: "I made arancini," which she interpreted as, "You are missed," and also life continues. She extended her hospital contract by 2 months. On the 28th day, 3 days before the month was complete, her phone rang at 11 in the evening with a Sicilian country code. She picked up on the second ring. "You said a month," his voice said, without preamble. "It's the 28th day." "I counted incorrectly." A pause. "Or I became impatient." Another pause. "Which is not something that happens to me. I want you to know that." She sat up in her bed in the apartment with the parking garage view, in the October dark, with the city sounds of Boston outside the window. Different sounds from the orange grove, different birds, different dark. And she felt the warmth of him across the Atlantic, across the distance, steady as ever. "How is the situation?" she asked. "Resolved." A pause. "Permanently." She didn't ask about Corsetti. "And Vitale?" "Also resolved." She breathed out. "Enzo?" Something shifted in his voice, not the controlled, diplomatic shift, the real kind. He showed Marco the exercise yesterday, with visible pride. She laughed. The sound of it in the empty apartment felt like something opening. "Sofia." His voice changed again, became the nighttime voice, the loose-threaded voice. "I have thought about many things in the last month. Practical things. Things about what a life looks like that is not built only around the inheritance I carry." He stopped. "I've thought about what it would require to make space for something, someone, who exists outside of all this." She was quiet. "I haven't arrived at a complete answer," he said, "but I have arrived at the question, which is more than I had before." A pause. "Palermo in December is extraordinary. The Christmas markets in the Piazza Verdi, the presepi." A beat. "Concetta's Christmas baking, which is a genuine argument for the existence of God." "Are you inviting me to Palermo?" "I'm asking if you'd consider Palermo." She looked at the parking garage through the window. Its grey concrete levels, its orange-lit exit ramps, its profound and honest lack of romance. She looked at the windowsill, where the rosemary was in good condition and the basil was staging a recovery from a period of neglect, and the small pot of mint was doing what mint always did, which was try to take over. She thought about the library, the rose garden in December, which she had not seen but could imagine. Stripped of summer excess, the canes bare, but something still held in the architecture of the plants, the bones of the garden visible for once in the open winter light. "Tell me about Palermo in December," she said, and he did. She flew back on the 15th of December. She had told her mother, who had said, "Go, Sofia, go before you talk yourself out of it." She had arranged her hospital coverage, which required some negotiation and the leveraging of months of accumulated goodwill from colleagues who were aware she'd returned from Sicily different, if not entirely sure how, and who treated this trip with the careful neutrality of people who respect a mystery. She had written the email to the cooperative clinic, which had been delighted to hear from her, and had, immediately, and with the particular efficiency of people who understood that the world contained more variables than plans, offered her a part-time consulting arrangement that would let her contribute to the humanitarian program from Sicily when she was there, and from Boston when she wasn't. The when she was there and the when she wasn't had both landed in her chest with the weight of architecture. He met her at the airport. Not Marco. Him. She came through the arrivals hall with her bag on her shoulder and the borrowed copy of The Quiet American in her hand, returned as promised, and she saw him immediately, because he was the kind of man you saw immediately in any room, not only because of his height or the particular quality of his stillness, but because he was looking for her with the same total attention he gave everything, and the attention found her before she found him. She stopped. He crossed to her. He stopped a foot away, and she looked up at him, and the Palermo airport was its full, cacophonous self around them, arrivals and announcements and trolleys and families, and it was entirely irrelevant. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. She held out the book. He took it, looked down at it for a moment, at the worn cover and the pages she'd read twice now, and the notes she hadn't been able to resist making in the margins with a pencil that could be erased if he wanted to erase them. "Thank you for returning it," he said. "I said I would." "You always do what you say," he said. Not quite a question. "I try to." She met his eyes. "It's one of the few things I'm consistent about." He reached out and took her bag from her shoulder, simply, without asking, with the naturalness of someone resuming something that had been briefly set down, and turned toward the exit. She fell into step beside him. Palermo in December was exactly what he'd described. The Christmas markets with their lights and their smell of roasted almonds, and the presepe in the cathedral that dated from the 18th century, and was worth an hour of standing in front of, simply for the quality of what patience and faith and craft could produce together. The city in winter had a different intimacy than the city in the heat of September. The streets were quieter in a way that exposed the architecture, made the Arab Norman churches and the Baroque palazzi stand in cleaner relief, and the cold that arrived in the evenings off the sea was sharp enough to make you want to be inside somewhere warm. The first evening, they sat in the kitchen of the mansion, not the formal dining room, the kitchen, and he cooked. This surprised her more than almost anything, the absolute competence of him at the stove, unhurried and precise, something in pasta with sausage and fennel that her grandmother would have recognized. "Your mother taught you?" she asked. "Concetta," he said, "when I was 10 and very much underfoot." He stirred something. "She told me that a man who can cook is self-sufficient, and a man who is self-sufficient has negotiating power." She laughed. "She sounds like my grandmother." "When you meet her," he said, still stirring, very casually, "you should tell her that." When you meet her, not if, when. She absorbed this. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him cook and thought about when and everything it contained. They ate at the kitchen table, which was small and old, scarred with years of Concetta's work, and they talked for 2 hours without looking at a clock. And somewhere in the second hour, the talking became something else, became silence, but the kind of silence that was not empty, that was charged with all the things that had been building since a September courtyard and a broken heel, and the sound of a man trying to breathe through what was in his way. He cleared the plates. She stood and carried the glasses to the sink. They were both at the sink, a foot apart, and the kitchen was warm, and the night was black outside the window, and he turned and looked at her. And this time there was no "not tonight" available to either of them. He kissed her the way she'd known he would, not tentatively, not experimentally, but with the same quality of absolute intention he brought to everything, purposeful and controlled. And then, as she kissed him back, less controlled, the control being the thing that went last, the final piece of armour, and underneath it, the heat of him, and the realness of him, and the person he was when the load-bearing walls came down. She put her hand on his face, both hands, the way she'd been thinking about doing since a courtyard in September, and felt him lean into it like someone who had not been touched carefully in a very long time. "I'm not Mara," she said against his mouth. "No," he said, "you're not. I won't leave without telling you." His arms tightened around her. "I know." The kitchen settled around them, warm and old and ordinary and extraordinary. And outside the window, the Sicilian December dark held the orange groves, the roses sleeping through their winter, the sea somewhere beyond the hills, and the whole particular weight of a world that was imperfect and dangerous and real. She had a room. Not the room from her first time, that was the guest room, which was what it remained for the other guests who moved through the house with the careful invisibility of people who understood their place in the infrastructure. Her room was on the second floor, west-facing, with a view of the rose garden and the hills beyond, and it was smaller and less formally furnished, and entirely hers in a way the guest room had never been. She put the windowsill herbs on the windowsill, the rosemary and the basil which had been transported in their small pots in her carry-on with the ruthlessness of a woman committed to her garden. Concetta had looked at them with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite approval, and was precisely both, and had provided a larger pot for the mint, which was already attempting its usual territorial expansion. She settled into the rhythms of the house, and into her own rhythms, simultaneously. She was at the cooperative clinic 4 days a week, a formal arrangement now, consulting on trauma protocols, training the nursing staff in field triage, building the relationship that her 6-week training program had only begun. The work was good. It was different from emergency medicine, more deliberate, less reactive, and she found that the deliberateness suited something in her that the constant urgency of Boston trauma had been crowding out. On the 3 days she wasn't at the clinic, she was at the house, in the library, in the rose garden, in the kitchen, where she and Concetta had developed a working relationship that operated primarily through cooking and the wordless communication of people who shared a space and a purpose. She also took over Enzo's physical therapy entirely, which delighted him and gave her the particular satisfaction of watching something improve in real time, the weeks accumulating into measurable progress, the old body learning a new way to carry itself. And Dante. Dante was still what he was. The phone calls at midnight, the men moving through the house with their earpieces and their careful faces, the operational life that ran beneath the domestic one like an underground river. She did not pretend this was otherwise. She did not look away from it or bracket it as a part of him she could selectively ignore. But she also came to understand, more fully than she had in the first 2 weeks, the texture of what he was trying to do with the power he held. He was not, and she had suspected this, and now she knew, a man who had simply inherited and perpetuated. He was actively, carefully, at enormous personal cost, attempting to move something old and terrible towards something less terrible. Not innocence. He was not naive about what the word innocence would mean for a man in his position, but a managed reduction of harm, a generational shift in what the family stood for, the application of power toward protection more than destruction. "You're trying to stop something," she said to him one night, in the rose garden in January, the roses stripped of everything but their structure, the air cold and clear. "Not just hold it." He looked at her. I'm trying not to be my grandfather, or my father, entirely. A pause. My grandfather was what this world is at its worst. My father was better. I'm trying to be better than him. And whoever comes after me... He stopped. Whoever comes after you, she said. He looked at the winter roses. Yes, she looked at him in profile, at the clean, hard line of him against the pale January sky, and she thought, this is the longest view I have ever stood in. The generational view. The view from a family that thinks in decades and centuries rather than appointments and deadlines. She thought, and I am here in it. Not accidentally anymore. In February, she went back to Boston for 2 weeks. She had an apartment lease to renew or decline, furniture to assess, belongings to determine were worth carrying across the Atlantic or worth releasing. Her mother came up from Providence for the weekend, and they had the kind of conversation that could only happen over 2 days and 2 pots of coffee and a walk along the Charles in the grey February light. He's not a safe man, her mother said. No. Is he a good man? She thought about this carefully, because her mother deserved careful. He's trying to be, she said, genuinely, which I think is the honest version of the answer. Rosaria had looked at the river for a long time. She had come from a family that knew about the complexity of good men and bad structures and the degrees between. She had her own inherited understanding of what it meant to love someone whose world was not simple. Can you be yourself there? She asked finally. I can be more myself there than almost anywhere I've been, Sofia said. Then that's the answer, her mother said. The rest is details. She sold the furniture. She put the few things that mattered in storage. She renewed the apartment lease for 1 more month as a psychological safety net, then let it go. She flew back to Palermo on the 1st of March, spring arriving in the hills, the almond trees in blossom, the orange grove waking into bloom, the rose garden beginning the first tentative movement of new growth. She watched it happen from the window of her room, the rosemary on the sill, the mint in Concetta's pot, and she thought, I live here. And the sentence, which was still strange and slightly frightening and not yet entirely settled in her body, was also the truest thing she had thought in years. Spring in the hills above Palermo was a revolution. Sofia had not been prepared for it, not truly prepared, not in the way you could be prepared for something that arrived with the force of something that had been building underground for months. The almond blossoms had been beautiful, pale and ephemeral, but they were a prelude. What came after? The citrus grove erupting into blossom, the orange flowers so heavy with scent that standing in the grove in the morning was a sensory experience on the edge of overwhelming. The rose garden unfurling in stages over the weeks of March and April, first the climbers on the south wall, and then the concentric circles working outward until the whole walled garden was improbably, outrageously alive. This was not merely beautiful. This was the argument that the world made for itself when left to its own logic. She was in the grove on a Tuesday morning in April with the espresso she had brought out in the small ceramic cup from the kitchen when Marco appeared at the edge of the trees. Marco, whose face she had learned to read in the way she read patient faces, the micro-expressions, the held information, was carrying something she hadn't seen there before. Not urgency exactly, which she'd seen plenty of. Something different. Something more careful than urgency. Sofia? He rarely called her by name. Could you come inside? What happened? Please, come inside. She went. The sitting room had 4 people in it: Dante, Marco, a man she didn't recognize who had the look of a lawyer or a senior operative, or possibly both, and a woman of 60 who was sitting very straight in the chair nearest the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression that had been made in the same foundry as Dante's. His mother's sister, Zia Paola. She had been pointed out in a photograph once, mentioned twice, and Sofia had assembled a rough outline of her. A woman who had kept her distance from the family's operations by living in Milan, but who had never entirely left the orbit of the family's world, who had watched from a calculated remove, and who had maintained, over decades, a particular kind of authority that was not about power, but about status, about being the last person old enough to remember everything from the beginning. She looked at Sofia with the focused attention of assessment. "You must be the American nurse," she said, in Italian. "Sofia Caruso," Sofia said, in Italian. She crossed the room and offered her hand, and Zia Paola took it and held it for a moment rather than shaking it, which Sofia recognized as a reading gesture, a physical assessment. "Sit down," Zia Paola said, "both of you." Dante sat, Sofia sat. The lawyer-operative man was very quiet near the door. What followed was extraordinary in its directness. Zia Paola had come from Milan because a man named Fioravanti, an old enemy of the family, connected to a Calabrian organisation that had been making incursions into Palermo's territory for 2 years, had sent her a message. The message concerned Sofia. It contained photographs from the mansion, from the courtyard in September, from the airport in December. It contained information that should not have been available to anyone outside the family circle. And it contained a proposal that Zia Paola use her influence to encourage Dante to come to a meeting at a neutral location to discuss terms. The implicit threat in the photographs of Sofia was not stated. It didn't need to be. Dante's voice, when he spoke, was the flattest she had ever heard it. "When did this arrive?" "Yesterday." Zia Paola looked at him steadily. "I came immediately." "You should have called." "I wanted to see your face when I told you." She looked at his face. "Yes, as I thought." She turned to Sofia. "You understand what this means?" "There's a breach in the security," Sofia said. "Someone inside the house, or someone with regular access, who has been photographing us and feeding the information out." Dante's jaw was a hard line. "Yes." "When was the last security assessment?" Marco answered. 6 weeks ago. After the Corsetti situation was resolved, He stopped. "We may have relaxed our attention." "You may have," Zia Paola said, with the cool precision of a woman who did not do relaxed attention. She looked at Dante. "The question is, what you do." "I'll find who it is," Dante said, "and I'll handle Fioravanti." "That's not the question." Zia Paola looked at Sofia, then back at Dante. "The question is whether you put this woman in harm's way by keeping her here while you find them." The room was very quiet. Sofia looked at Dante. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor between his feet, and she could see the precise, terrible calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of things that were not reducible to simple calculation. "I'll go," Sofia said. Both of them looked at her. "Temporarily. To Milan or Rome, or wherever makes the most sense operationally. I'll stay until this is resolved, and then I'll come back. She held Dante's gaze. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you the sensible course of action, which I think you already know. His jaw worked. I don't want you. I know you don't. She held his gaze. But I'm a complication you can't afford right now, and keeping me here out of whatever this is puts both of us at risk, and your people at risk. She paused. So I'll go, and I'll come back. Zia Paula looked at her nephew. Something in the older woman's face shifted, something that had been held in reserve, some judgment suspended, arrived at a conclusion. She's right, Zia Paula said. I know she's right, Dante said quietly. The flatness in his voice was not anger, she understood now. It was grief. The specific grief of being required to let something go again, to choose correctly for someone you would rather simply keep. Milan, he said, with Zia Paula, 1 week, 2 at most. He looked at Sofia. Then you come back. Then I come back, she said. Zia Paula rose from her chair, which seemed to indicate the meeting was concluded. As she passed Sofia's chair, she paused and looked down at her and said quietly in Italian something that was too rapid and too Milanese for Sofia to catch fully, but which she thought, from the tone and from the expression on Zia Paula's face, was something like, he needed someone exactly like you. She went to pack. He came to her door while she was packing. He stood in the doorway, and she was folding things into her bag, and they were both in the economy of action that comes before necessary departures, and she thought, this is the second time I've packed in this house and left him standing in the space behind me, and the difference between the first time and this time was everything, was the entire universe of what changes when two people have moved through the stages of knowing each other toward the clear country on the other side. 2 weeks, he said. Yes. He crossed to her, stood behind her, and she felt his arms come around her, not urgently, not desperately, but with the specific weight of someone holding something they have decided to trust to time and distance and the reliability of returns. She put her hands over his, felt the warmth of him, the realness of him. Find the breach, she said. Deal with Fioravanti. And then, I want the rose garden in full bloom. I missed it last year. A breath against her hair, almost a laugh. It will be at its best in May. Then fix your problem before May. He pressed his face briefly to her hair, and she felt the held quality of it, the restraint of a man who did not perform emotion, but felt it profoundly and privately. And then he let go. Go with Zia Paula, he said. Be patient with her. She will interrogate you thoroughly about your intentions. I'll survive it. I know you will. He looked at her with those dark, burning eyes. You survive everything. She picked up her bag. She went to the door. She turned once, just once, because once was enough and more was too much, and looked at him, standing in her room, with the windowsill herbs behind him, the rosemary and the basil and the mint in Concetta's pot, and she said, I'll be back for May. And she left. Zia Paola's apartment in Milan was on the 4th floor of a building near the Brera, all high ceilings and old paintings, and a library that was smaller than the one in the mansion, but denser, more curated, the collection of a woman who knew precisely what she wanted. The interrogation began on the first evening, and was conducted, like all effective interrogations, over dinner. "Tell me about your family," Zia Paola said, pouring wine with the precision of someone for whom imprecision in small things was a gateway to imprecision in large ones. "My father was from Naples originally, third generation in America. My mother's family is from the Veneto, going back further." Sofia cut her bread. "I'm the oldest. I have a brother, younger, who is a teacher in Providence." "Catholic?" "Culturally." Zia Paola made a sound that acknowledged this distinction without judging it. "And your work? You chose nursing specifically." "My father had a cardiac event when I was 16. I was there. I was the one who called the ambulance." She paused. "He survived that time. He died of a second event when I was 23. But the first one, the feeling of being the person who knew what to do in the worst moment, I never lost that." Zia Paola regarded her over the rim of her wineglass. "You chose a profession that puts you in worst moments." "Yes. And then you chose a man whose life is made of worst moments." Sofia looked at her steadily. "I chose a man who is trying to make the worst moments less frequent. That's not the same thing as being drawn to catastrophe." Something in Zia Paola's face shifted. Not approval, exactly, but the withholding of disapproval, which in a woman like this was probably equivalent. "He hasn't been—" Zia Paola stopped, chose the next word with care. "He has been solitary for a long time, after Julia, after Mara, after his father." She set down her glass. "He stopped letting people see him. I think you may be an exception to that, and I'm not entirely sure it's safe for either of you." "I don't think safety is the primary criterion," Sofia said. Zia Paola looked at her for a long time. "No," she said, "it never is for the people worth knowing." She was in Milan for 12 days. Zia Paola was extraordinary company, formidably intelligent, witty in the dry Milanese way, and possessed of a memory for the family history that was encyclopedic and not always kind, which meant that her stories of Dante at various ages were illuminating and occasionally somewhat humiliating for him as a subject. She told Sofia about his childhood, about the gap between the public child, serious, watchful, always the heir, and the private one, who had read Jane Austen because his mother had, and who had cried, aged 12, when the rabbit he'd kept in the garden died, and had then been mortified by the crying, and had spent 3 days not crying at anything to compensate. "He cried when Julia died," Sofia said. Zia Paola was quiet for a moment. "You've seen him cry?" "Not exactly. I've seen where the crying went." She thought about the rose garden in winter, the piano at 2 in the morning. "He keeps it in specific places." The older woman nodded slowly. "Yes, that's right." She looked out the window at the Brera neighbourhood, at the ordinary Milanese life flowing below. "That's exactly right." She also received information from Dante's operations over the 12 days, not through official channels, but through Zia Paola's apparently comprehensive network of sources, which operated through means Sofia preferred not to examine too closely. The breach had been found. A man who worked the security rotation, who had a gambling debt to a Fioravanti-connected creditor that had been leveraged into something operational. The man was no longer in a position to transmit information. Fioravanti himself had been sent an answer to his proposal that was explicit and non-negotiable, and that Zia Paola described only as definitive. On the 12th day, she received a text, just an address, in the hills above Palermo, and 3 words: the roses opened. She booked a flight for the following morning. Zia Paola drove her to Malpensa herself, the older woman's driver, the older woman's car, the older woman's characteristic manner of treating the approach to an airport like a military maneuver. At the drop-off, Zia Paola got out of the car, which Sofia hadn't expected, and embraced her, briefly, firmly, with the economy of someone who has never been extravagant with physical affection, but means it precisely when she is. "You'll find it strange," Zia Paola said, "from time to time, what his life requires, what you're required to be in it." She stepped back. "Come to Milan when you need to breathe differently. My door is open." Sofia looked at her, at this woman who had maintained her connection to a complicated family through decades of difficult things, and who had found, apparently in Sofia, something that warranted continuation. "Thank you," she said, "for the interrogation and everything after." Zia Paola made the sound that was not quite a laugh, and was warmer than a not laugh. "Go," she said, "before you miss your flight." The roses were extraordinary. She had known they would be. He had told her. Marco had mentioned it in passing once. Concetta had sent a photograph in February with the caption, "Waiting." But knowledge and the thing itself were the usual distance apart. And when the car turned through the gate, and she could smell the garden before she could see it, could smell it even through the closed windows, even over the warm stone and citrus smell of the Sicilian afternoon, she understood that she had been imagining something smaller than reality. He was in the rose garden. She found him there, past the house, past the kitchen garden where the herbs were rioting into their spring abundance, through the door in the southern wall, and he was standing at the old iron bench near the south wall, with his jacket off and his hands in his pockets, looking at the roses the way he always looked at things he needed to understand. He turned when he heard the gate. She stopped just inside the door, and they looked at each other across the walled garden, across the roses in their May extravagance, across the weeks and the distance and everything that had accumulated and resolved and remained. He looked well. She catalogued this with the nurse's eye before anything else, the automatic assessment, good colour, regular posture, no held pain, nothing being managed. He looked, she thought, more himself than she had seen him. Whatever the past weeks had required, they had required it cleanly, and he was on the other side of it. She walked toward him. He met her halfway because he was done with standing at the door while she crossed the distance, which she understood and which was its own declaration. She put her arms around him, and his came around her, and they were in the rose garden in May, with the extraordinary extravagance of the thing her mother-in-law by roses had planted, and her father had kept, and no one had destroyed, and the scent of it was too much and exactly right, and Sofia thought, "Here, this is the place I was walking toward when I took the wrong turn down Via dell'Incoronazione and broke a heel on the cobblestones and pushed open a gate into a courtyard." "The roses," she said, against his shoulder. "Yes." His voice was everything it was at 2 in the morning, the loose-threaded, real voice. Everything bloomed at once. Concetta said she'd never seen it like this. "Your mother's autobiography," she said. He tightened his arms fractionally. She thought about what a garden was, all the accumulated choices of it, the things planted and tended and allowed to go wild, and the things that kept growing without anyone to direct them. The honest record of what a person had loved and where they had stood. She pulled back and looked up at him. "Tell me what happened with Fioravanti." "Handled." "Dante." "Permanently handled." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to tell you every detail." "I know. But tell me what I need to know." A pause. He understood the message. There won't be another proposal. She nodded. She believed him. She also believed that the permanently handled contained things she would never entirely know. And she had made her peace with this in Milan. Over 12 days of Zia Paola's wine and honesty had arrived at the specific kind of peace that is not innocence, but is a considered choice to be present to a life rather than to all its underside. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up at him. "I want to ask you properly, with full understanding of what I'm asking." He held her gaze, and his eyes were everything they had always been, dark and burning and honest, in the way that had always gotten through her defences, because the honesty was real, had always been real, was the thing she'd seen in the yellow security light in a Palermo courtyard before she knew any of the rest of it. "I know what this life is. I know what it asks of the people in it. I know what you've had to navigate in the months since September. And I know that the navigation is not finished, that it never finishes exactly." "No," she said, "it doesn't." "Knowing all of that," he said, "will you stay? Not as a guest. Not for 2 weeks or a month or until the situation resolves." He reached up and touched her face, both hands now, the way she had first touched his, and she leaned into it the way he had. "Stay with me, here, in this house, in this life, for whatever this life is." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Boston and the parking garage and the windowsill. She thought about 12 days in Milan and Zia Paola's wine and the permission she'd given herself, finally, to trust what she knew rather than what she feared. She thought about 9 years of careful, sensible construction and the Sicilian September that had walked into it like weather, like something you couldn't have predicted and couldn't have prevented and wouldn't undo if you could. She thought about the rose garden, about a woman she had never met whose autobiography was all around them. All this extravagant, blooming life that had outlasted the person who planted it and kept growing in the direction of light. "I already am," she said. He kissed her then. Not the careful, controlled kiss of December, not the managed thing, but the real thing, the full weight of what he was and what she was and what they had been growing toward since a courtyard and a broken heel, and the sound of a man trying to breathe through what stood between him and life. The roses were everywhere around them, every colour she could name and colours she couldn't, climbing the walls and arching over the iron pergola and making their case for the world, for the persistence of beautiful things, for the audacity of growing. That night she found the piano room without the sound leading her there. She went on her own, in the dark, from memory, because she had memorized the house now the way you memorize a face you've decided to know. Not deliberately, not strategically, but through the accumulated presence of it. She sat in the high-backed chair. She didn't call for him. He found her there. He always did. He sat at the Börsendorfer and looked at her once, in the moonlight, the look that was just him looking at her, nothing managed in it. And then he turned to the keys and began to play. The Chopin first, then the piece she didn't recognize, the one that moved in intervals that felt like questions. Then something new, something that had not been there in September, something she had not heard him play before, a melody that was tentative in its beginning and then found its footing, grew more certain, moved through its questions towards something that was not quite resolution, but was the direction of it, the leaning toward. She sat in the high-backed chair and listened, and the moon moved across the floor in its slow arc, and the rose garden was sleeping outside, saving itself for morning, and the house was all around them, with its history and its paintings and its library and its dead and its living. And the orange trees in the grove were making their own dark plans for April and May. She fell asleep in the chair. She woke in the chair. She was covered with the blanket, the same blanket, she was certain, that had appeared in December, and the piano bench was empty and the moon was gone, replaced by the particular grey that arrives just before dawn, the light that is not day yet, but is the premise of it. She sat for a moment in the grey, in the quiet. Then she heard him, heard his step in the hall, the familiar economy of it, not going, but coming back. The door opened. He came in with 2 cups of coffee, which struck her as so domestically, impossibly perfect, that she almost laughed. And he looked at her, sitting in the chair, in the blanket, with her dark hair in its overnight disorder. And he stopped for a moment, and looked at her with those eyes that were everything they always were. And he said, "You're still here." Not surprise, not quite. Something better than surprise. Something that had learned not to take certain things for granted and was discovering, slowly, the particular grace of being surprised to have them anyway. "I'm still here," she said. She took the coffee. He sat on the piano bench facing her, and they drank their coffee in the grey room, while the dawn assembled itself outside, light arriving by degrees, and beyond the tall windows the rose garden began to materialize out of the dark. First shapes, then colours, then the extraordinary profusion of it, the reds and the pinks and the creams and the whites, all that life insisting on itself in the early May morning. She would go to the clinic today. She would check on Enzo's hip and write her notes and consult with the staff and come home in the evening to the house in the hills and whatever the evening held. He would conduct his life, the operational, complicated, perpetually managed life, and she would be part of it and not part of it, and wholly herself in it, which was the thing she had been afraid was impossible and had turned out to be the only thing that mattered. She would write to her mother this afternoon. She would call on Sunday as usual, and her mother would say, "You look different," and she would say, "I am different," and her mother would say, "Good different or bad different?" and she would say, "I'll let you decide." And her mother, who was not a fool and who had 4 generations of Italian-American women's knowledge of impossible loves in her bones, would say, "Go. Be happy. Call on Sundays." She would. The rose garden was fully visible now, fully itself, the Sicilian May morning receiving it in the particular generous light of the island. A single bird began in the orange grove, the first, then others joining, the daily argument for the world, the ordinary, daily, remarkable fact of it. She looked at him across the piano bench, across the coffee cups, across the months and the distance and the particular long road of what they were to each other. He was looking back at her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. Outside, the roses kept their colour in the climbing light. The orange trees released their blossom scent into the warm beginning of the day. Somewhere over the hills, the sea was doing what the sea does. Indifferent and constant and gorgeous and real, always real. The thing that was there before any of them and would be there after. Sofia Caruso, who had come to Sicily for 6 weeks and had stayed for something she had not known how to name at the beginning and knew now in her bones, lifted her face toward the light coming through the tall windows, felt the warmth of it, and thought, "Here, here, here." In the rose garden that afternoon, tending the south wall where the darkest roses grew, the deep red, almost black at the centre, Concetta said to no one in particular, to the roses, to the spirit of the woman who had planted them, to the warm May air. She stayed. The roses, in their extravagance, in their riotous colour, and their historical persistence, in their faithful testimony to everything that had been planted here, and loved here, and lost here, and found here again, did not answer. They didn't need to. They had been saying it all along.